The Supreme Court on Thursday struck down affirmative action in college admissions, declaring the race cannot be a factor and forcing the institutions of higher education to look for new ways to achieve diverse student bodies.
And Divya, this comes as a big blow to this decades-old practice that really was a boost for educational opportunities for African Americans and other minorities. Now, the court's conservative majority overturned admissions plans at Harvard and University of North Carolina, which are the nation's oldest private and public colleges. Now, what is the reason? The Chief Justice John Roberts wrote in the majority opinion that while affirmative action was well-intentioned and implemented in good faith, it cannot last forever and it amounted to unconstitutional discrimination against others. He said that the student must be treated based on his or her experiences as individuals and not on the basis of race.
Many reactions coming in. In fact, former President Donald Trump, the current presidential frontrunner, has taken to social media to react, saying that this was a decision and it has been a great day for America, people with extraordinary ability and everything else necessary for success, including future greatness for our country, are finally being rewarded. So, their reactions. So, we have Donald Trump on one hand totally seconding that decision that's come about, but totally contradictory to what President Biden thinks.
Absolutely. The Biden administration is strongly disagreeing. President Biden said that he strongly disagrees with this decision. Even the former President Barack Obama has said in a statement that affirmative action actually allowed generations of students like Michelle Obama and himself to prove that we belonged. So those are the major reactions coming in. And let's really understand what this means from prominent voices who are now joining us on the broadcast. We have Nish Acharya, an advisor to the Biden administration and former Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship for President Obama, joining us. Along with that, we have Rick Mehta, an entrepreneur and adjunct professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center and a former nominee for the U.S. Senate. Along with that, we have Vijay Engam, who is an affirmative action opponent and who is a strong supporter of students for fair admissions in their case against Harvard and UNC. We also have Anand Ahuja, attorney at Law New York, which is a New York-based who's a New York-based attorney. We also have Raj Putoria, a youth political advocate. Let me first start with you, Nish Acharya. So, essentially, the court is saying that you can't consider somebody's race, somebody's ethnicity when you grant admissions. What does this mean for minorities who might be aspiring to study in the United States?
Well, I think it's a very bad decision. And I think if you look at the history of our community as Indian Americans, we were the beneficiary of this from start to finish. So in just 60 years ago, until 1965, there was no immigration from non-European countries. And the passage of the Civil Rights Act and affirmative action rules allowed for that to happen. And now there's 5 million Indian Americans in the United States, and we're the most successful minority community there is. So we have benefited from this. And so if you believe in a society where diversity is important to organizations, and you believe in paying it forward, this is affirmative action is an important policy to have. So what this will do is it will in fact restrict probably international students who cannot afford to pay full tuition out of pocket. So the wealthier Indian students, for example, who want to come, will still have an opportunity. But those requiring scholarships now will find a lesser opportunity for their diverse mix of talents to be reflected. And those who say that it's just because of their STEM studying or engineering, that's not the way the admissions process works. It's much more diverse. And the other quick thing I'll mention is, people say that this would be good for Indian American students, but in fact, there's no evidence that any Indian Americans were harmed because of affirmative action. The numbers who wanted to go to college have all gone to college. Maybe not their first choice, but almost all of them have gone. So certainly some elite colleges may see a spike in Indian American students, but there's no evidence that Indian Americans have been denied the opportunity to go to college simply because of affirmative action.
Right. Let's also, go across to Anand Ahuja. How did colleges use affirmative action in admissions before? Was there any formalized quota that was set aside for people belonging to different races?
Yes. First of all, I would like to make a comment on what just now your panelists mentioned. that Indians are not going to Indians are going to be adversely affected. If you see both these cases, the case concerning Harvard University's admission policy, it basically is based upon anti-Asian American students' policies. It was pro-black students and it was anti-Asian Americans. And if I'm not mistaken, we Indians very much fall under the category of Asian Americans. We don't fall under the category of Caucasian Americans. So saying that Indians were not adversely affected, in fact, both the cases, the case of University of North Carolina deals both discrimination against white Americans and Asian Americans, and case relating to Harvard University exclusively deals of discrimination against Asian American students. So under the current policy, what was going on, that at the time of admission, first of all, it's admission related. The case is relating to purely admission. Case is not related to any financial aid or scholarship or anything. So today's decision relates only and only to the extent of admission into the colleges. Now the question is, if you see Indian Americans, basically they are very bright students. If you see their grades, most of the time you'll see Indian students in here in this country, they are amongst the toppers. If you see spelling bee and those kind of competitions, Indian students invariably win those competitions. Still, when it comes to admission into a college is concerned, especially I'm talking of Harvard University, then blacks were getting priority over Indian American students. So I personally believe it's a very good case as far as Indian American students are concerned. Otherwise also, I personally believe for blacks also, it's a good case in the sense because otherwise it was killing the spirit of competitiveness amongst black students because they were taking it for granted that, okay, we don't have to compete. So if you don't have that spirit of competition, then in the long run, you are a loser. You may be a gainer in the short run because you are getting an opportunity to enter into a school or college. The other important thing is in any professional institution, say for example in a medical school, the admission should be based upon merit of a student, not based on race or caste of a person. Like in India also, we have the policy, reservation policy, where whether you deserve or not, when you come from a particular quota, you come from a particular caste, so that means you will get priority over a person of the upper caste.
So you are welcoming this order by the Supreme Court, and let's just get a counter opinion on this. And in fact, that's what most voices supporting this have said, that people who deserve to get admissions and people who have the merit for it should get these admissions. But Vijay Ingam, you're also an opponent of affirmative action. So while we say that people who have the merit and who have the academics to support to get their admissions, on the other side, a point that Michelle Obama also made in her statement, that people coming in from minorities, they don't have the same privileges as people coming from the majority ethnic communities do. So how do we internalize that? Because then it's not really a fair level playing field, is it?
So when I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, I met this constitutional law professor by the name of Barack Obama. And I remember looking at the guy and saying, if this guy, this light-skinned guy, can call himself black and benefit from affirmative action, then why can't I? So I, of course, applied to medical school as an African American, shaved my head, I trimmed my long Indian eyelashes, and I got into medical school despite the fact that my 3.1 GPA was dramatically lower than their average of 3.7 at the time. Now, my friend Edward Bloom at Students for Fair Admission showed that under similar category statistics, an African American with similar grades and test scores had about a 75% chance of admission to Harvard, whereas an Asian American had a 25% chance. That was the statistical data he got from Harvard University based on his analysis. So I want to make it clear to all of you there and the entire population of India that affirmative action is discrimination against Asian Americans, and I'm living proof of that. I'm living proof that that exists.
So you're
That's
saying
massive
you
discrimination
posed to
against
be
Asians.
a black man to get admission?
Absolutely. I posed as a black man. I wrote a book called Almost Black, which tells the story of how I posed as a black man to gain admission to medical school, despite the fact that my grades and test scores did not meet those standards while I was an undergraduate student at the University of Chicago. It makes a huge difference. And the funny part is, until this ruling, you could pull the same scam today and it would probably work. So don't let anyone tell you that affirmative action is not discrimination against Asian Americans. Now, people talk about what is going to happen now that affirmative action is ended. Well, after I dropped out of medical school, I got my MBA at UCLA, which I'm proudly wearing my UCLA shirt today, where I learned that a school that doesn't practice affirmative action in admissions. And I'm proud to say that I got in based on merit. And I learned that it was possible to have a diverse class of African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanics, and whites, and a rich educational experience without practicing racial discrimination in the form of affirmative action. So don't let anybody tell you that affirmative action is essential for a good education.
Right. Let's take our next question.
Regarding the issue of economic equity you brought up, affirmative action benefits based on what box you check, not your socioeconomic background.
Right.
Okay, so let's ask Rick Mehta now. Has race been a criterion for admission in all colleges so far? Isn't it that universities in California and Florida have already banned race as a factor?
Well, look at the facts of the case, right? And I agree with my colleagues who mentioned that Asian Americans were heavily discriminated. What I think we need to understand in what's happening in this country is the complete antithesis of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that talked about creating equality. Remember, in the history of our country, we had segregation, then separation, separate but equal, and then we were moving towards more of an equal, race-neutral, rather than being a race-conscious country. And what's happening with affirmative action is that it's moving the country backward, where now races are being pitted against each other. Keep in mind, Asian Americans are the minority of the minority, right? When you talk about majority minority, you're talking about African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and we know that Asian Americans are still the minority of the minority and are being discriminated, right? We also know that the Biden administration has never looked favorably among Indian Americans. I mean, Joe Biden himself has made so many discriminatory racist comments against Indian Americans throughout the history. So it's no surprise that he's unhappy with today's ruling that puts all minorities to be treated equally and all Americans to be treated equally under the law. And so it's quite bizarre, the kind of reactions that are coming out, where we're trying to move our country to be race neutral, where we're trying to make sure that our children have advantages, have the same advantages, and that we're looking beyond the color of our skin. If you look at literally the facts of the case, you see that under personality ratings, that Harvard and UNC continuously rated Asian Americans lower, meaning they had poorer personality traits, in order to compensate for the lower academic performances of other demographic and minority groups. And so we've become a race-conscious country, and that actually is a very difficult premise for us to be able to move forward, especially for our children, where we want to teach our children not to see people's color of their skin.
Rick Mehta, let me just quickly get this clarity from you. This case concerned admissions at the University of Howard and University of North Carolina. So does this mean, the Supreme Court ruling means this will apply to all universities across the United States?
Yeah, all public universities across the United States, exactly.
But there were certain universities, about 9 states had already banned this ruling. Is that right, Rick?
I don't know what other states have done. All I can know is that this is the law of the land now. If the Supreme Court makes a decision, public universities cannot use race as the basis of admissions, which they were so frequently doing. Now, keep in mind, this is very important. This is a reversal of the previous decision of 2003, of which even a liberal justice in 2003, Sandra Day O'Connor, had already said that this case was going to be timestamped, that they were very concerned about affirmative action, and that 25 years from now, meaning 2028, should technically be the end of affirmative action. So we all knew that it was coming to an end, so no one should be really really surprised by this. And yet, if you look fast forward, 20 years later from 2003, nothing has really changed in terms of the discriminatory practices. Now, I'll tell you, and as Americans have become extremely race-focused in our country. I think today is a historical ruling and a historical day to start to make us more race-neutral and really lead the way to stop looking at the color of our skin and start looking at our academic
All right,
merits.
let's get in the last voice from a youth on the show. We have Raj Bhutoria, who's also with us. And Raj, tell us what the student community thinks about this. As you just heard, that some voices say that people should be rewarded for their academics, for their merits, and not on the basis of the color of their skin. So what do you think about this, and how do you think the student community is receiving this?
Absolutely. First, I'd like to respond to some of my fellow panelists by citing two statistics. The first one is that 60% of Indo-Americans actually are in support of affirmative action. So there is a vocal majority here within the United States of Indian Americans who are supposedly affected by this policy, who are yet in support of it. Second, one of the colleges named in this act is Harvard University. A study was published recently in April 2023 from Harvard University's admission statistics that stated that Asian Americans' admissions into Harvard University reached its highest level ever, while Black and Hispanic admissions fell. And this was while affirmative action was in place. So you can only imagine how this is removing protections for disadvantaged communities at a time when admissions are already falling. So within the student community, affirmative action is an incredible force that's allowed universities to combat systemic racism and generations of inequality. There are millions of families out there whose parents did not get the opportunity to go to college, who grew up with poor financial means and go to high schools that are underfunded, who yet have to compete with students from privileged backgrounds to achieve the same things. The fundamental goal of affirmative action and all related policies was to create a level playing field. That means a student who comes to the admissions office, who has the same qualifications and has achieved the same things as another student, but has faced incredible hardship, should be granted admission over the other student because they have had to dig themselves out of a much larger hole. With the loss of affirmative action, this means that diversity within colleges and across the United States are going to be hurt. That means economic opportunity will not be offered equally. As you mentioned, and a few other folks have mentioned, President Donald Trump said this will allow students to receive, with extraordinary merit, to receive admission. Now, there is talent, creativity, and hard work across the United States. However, opportunity and access to opportunity in the American dream is not equal. And that was the fundamental goal of affirmative action. Now, one thing I will agree with my other panelists is that affirmative action was never meant to be a permanent solution. It was always meant to be a band-aid fix to a real American problem, which is generational inequality and systemic racism. Affirmative action was just meant to create a fix on a larger issue that should have been solved in the last several decades, but it hasn't. And for that reason, the removal of affirmative action is premature, and it will cause more harm than good. Because, for example, legacy admissions, which primarily help white students who come from families whose parents have previously gone to college, will still be able to attend these colleges under legacy admission standards. And that hurts all minorities, Indian Americans included. Now, I think the path forward here is that colleges need to take financial means, the funding of high schools, as well as the racial makeup of zip codes into account. So what this will mean is college admissions and universities will still take race indirectly into account, but will only further the black box of college admissions. So overall, I think this policy is a net loss for the United States, and I think this is a sad day in American history.
Right, very divided as far as reactions coming out of that ruling. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.